The snow had been falling since noon, and by the time the valet took Grant Holloway's keys outside the Arcadia room on the 42nd floor, the whole city below had softened into a blur of orange light and drifting white. Elise Tanner watched it through the tall windows, while her husband arranged 3 things on the table in front of her, one at a time, the way a man lays out instruments before a procedure. A leather folder, a fountain pen, and a single folded sheet of paper he did not open, though she understood even before he spoke that it was the reason they were here. They were not alone. That was the part she would remember later when she tried to explain it to herself. He had chosen a room full of people. The Arcadia was the sort of place where the city's developers and financiers came to be seen being generous, and tonight it was crowded. A foundation dinner, silent auction, waiters gliding between tables with trays of something that steamed faintly in the candlelight. 200 people, easily, and Grant had picked this night, this room, to end their marriage in front of all of them. Beside him sat a woman named Sloane Whitaker. Grant had introduced her, months ago, as a brand consultant. Elise had smiled and shaken her hand and known, in the immediate animal way a person knows these things, exactly what Sloane was. Tonight Sloane wore a column of dark green silk, and the particular composure of someone who has already decided how the evening will go. She did not look at Elise. She looked at the room, at the chandeliers, at the little gold place cards, at everything except the woman across the table whose life she had been quietly rearranging. "I had Kessler draw them up this week," Grant said. He didn't lower his voice. "That was deliberate too. It's clean. You keep the condo on Sherburne, not the Rosedale house. That's held by the company. You were never on title. The car lease transfers back to me at the end of the month." Elise looked at the folder and did not touch it. "Grant, I'm not here to negotiate." He turned the pen so it lay parallel to the folder's edge. He had always done small things like that, aligning objects, straightening frames, as if the world could be brought to heel one right angle at a time. "You've known this was coming since Christmas. Don't make it a scene." She almost laughed at that. Don't make it a scene. As if the scene were hers to make, as if he had not chosen the largest possible audience and then handed her the burden of keeping quiet inside it. At the next table, a woman in her 60s had gone still with her fork halfway up. A younger couple by the window had stopped talking. A server approached with a bottle wrapped in a white cloth, saw something in the geometry of their table, and drifted away without pouring. Grant leaned back. The candle threw the shadow of his jaw long across the cloth. "You don't belong in this," he said, gesturing at the room, at the chandeliers, at the whole gleaming architecture of his life. "And you never really did. I think you know that. I think somewhere you've always known it." The words did not arrive as cruelty. That was what made them land. There was no heat in them at all. He said them the way he might tell a subcontractor the poor date had slipped. A fact mildly regrettable, already priced in. Sloane reached for her wine. She turned the stem once between 2 fingers and said, softly, to no one, though it carried, "Some people are only ever a season." She smiled at the middle distance. "You don't hold on to a season." Fuel's tables heard. Elise felt it move through the room the way cold moves through a house when a door is left open. A small drop in the register of everything, conversations dipping, a fork set down too carefully somewhere behind her. She was aware, suddenly and precisely, of every person who had understood what was happening. 50-60 of them, all pretending to look at their plates. She picked up the pen. She would think about this moment for a long time afterward, and she would never once regret it, though people would tell her she should have thrown the folder at him, should have stood and said something the whole room would repeat. She did none of that. She opened the folder to the last page, found the line with her name typed beneath it, Elise Marie Tanner, in a lawyer's tidy font, and she signed. Her hand did not shake. She capped the pen, set it down exactly where he'd had it, and slid the folder back across the cloth until it touched his water glass. Then she stood. She took her coat from the back of the chair. She looked at Grant for what felt to both of them like a long time, though it was only a breath or two. "Be well," she said, "nothing else." She walked the length of the Arcadia room toward the doors, and the room was quiet enough that her heels sounded against the floor. And no one stopped her, and no one said her name, and the elevator came fast and empty and carried her down 42 floors while the numbers ticked, and the snow kept falling somewhere beyond the walls she couldn't see. Outside, the cold took her face like a hand. She got half a block down Front Street, past the shuttered kiosks and the gray heaps the plows had pushed against the curb, before the sidewalk tilted. It came without warning, a heaviness behind her eyes, a sense that the ground had let go of its usual promise. She reached for a lamppost and got her glove around it, but her knees had stopped listening. The streetlights smeared. A man in a parka caught her elbow, said something urgent she couldn't parse, and then the salted concrete came up cold and white to meet her, and there was nothing. She woke to fluorescent light and the smell of antiseptic and the small mechanical beeping of something patient beside her ear. A curtain, the color of a winter sky. A line taped to the back of her left hand. A nurse's face appearing through a gap in the fabric, kind and unhurried. There you are, the nurse said. You're at St. Aidan's. You fainted downtown. Somebody flagged a paramedic. You've been out about 20 minutes. Take it slow. Elise closed her eyes. Her head throbbed at the temples. Her mouth was dry as paper. When the nurse asked if there was anyone they could call, she almost said no, and the no sat in her mouth heavy and complete, because there was in fact no one. Her parents were a folder in a government office in a city she'd left at 19. She had no siblings that anyone had ever found. Grant's mother had never once called her by name. My husband's still listed on my file, she said finally, because it was the only true thing. Grant Holloway. It's an old form. The nurse wrote it down and went away, and Elise lay under the sky-colored curtain and let herself do the thing she hadn't done in the ballroom, which was simply to breathe in and out and until the ceiling stopped its faint swimming. Dr. Naomi Osi had been an emergency physician at St. Aidan's for 14 years, long enough that very little in the department could still surprise her. She was a calm woman, deliberate, the kind who read a chart twice before she said a word, and she had reviewed thousands of intake files without ever once feeling the back of her neck go cold the way it did now, standing at the workstation outside Bay 6. It was not the blood work, though the blood work was fine. Dehydration, low blood sugar, a stress faint, a first trimester the patient clearly hadn't clocked. It was the small silver disc the triage nurse had bagged with the patient's jewelry and noted on the property sheet. Pendant, worn engraved. The nurse had photographed it, as they did with anything that might matter for identification when a patient came in alone. Naomi had opened the photo to check for a medical alert marking, the way she always did. There was no medical marking. There was a coat of arms she half recognized and a single word beneath it, worn nearly smooth by decades of a thumb, Boval. Naomi sat with that for a moment. Then she pulled up the patient's registration and the government identity notes attached to it, and she read the line she was not supposed to find remarkable and found remarkable anyway. Ward of the Crown, Province of Quebec. Place 1991. No biological family located, and in the miscellaneous flags field, a note entered years ago by some records clerk in some office she would never see. Standing air search, Notaire Charbonneau, Sherbrooke. Contact if identity confirmed. She read it a second time. Then she walked to the charge nurse's desk and said quietly, "The woman in 6, who came in with her? Nobody. Paramedics." She collapsed on front. "We called the number on her file, the husband. He said he'd come by. Has anyone told him anything? Just that she's stable." "Keep it that way for now," Naomi said. She looked at the photograph on her screen one more time. She was not a fanciful woman, but she had grown up in a family that told stories, and she knew one when it began to move. When she pulled the curtain, Elise was sitting up, color back in her face. She had a stillness that Naomi noticed at once. Not the flatness of shock, but something older and more settled, the composure of a person who has learned to hold herself together because no one else ever offered to. "Miss Tanner." Naomi sat on the rolling stool and drew it close. "You're going to be fine. You fainted, and I want to keep you a little while, but you're not in any danger." She paused, choosing her ground. "I need to ask you some things that aren't strictly medical. You can tell me to stop at any point." Elise waited. She was good at waiting. "The pendant you were wearing," Naomi said. "The silver one. How long have you had it?" Something crossed Elise's face, surprise, and beneath it a small guardedness, as if the question had reached toward a part of her that no one had ever thought to ask about. "As long as I can remember. It came with me, out of the foster system." She said it the way people say things they've said many times and stopped feeling. "I was a ward in Quebec. I don't know anything about where I'm from. My mother died when I was born, I was told. No father on record. I was moved around. I came to Ontario at 19. She turned the words over. "Why are you asking me about a necklace?" Naomi felt the floor of the moment settle beneath her. "Because there's a note on your provincial record," she said carefully. "A very old one. It says that a notary in Sherbrooke has kept an open search running for a specific person for a long time, and the crest on your pendant matches a name in that note." She let a beat pass. "I'd like your permission to make a phone call. I want to be careful because if I'm right about what this is, things may start to move faster than either of us would choose. But I don't want to do anything without your consent. This is your name we're talking about, not anyone else's." Elise looked at her hands, at the tape on her knuckle, at the small blue veins beneath the skin. "What name?" she said. "Not a question, quite." "That's what I'd like to find out," Naomi said. "With your permission." There was a long silence, filled only by the beeping and the distant clatter of a department going about its night. "All right," Elise said at last, "make the call." It took 40 minutes for the first return call to come, and when it did, the woman on the other end, an assistant in a notary's office 300 kilometers east, roused at home on a snowbound Tuesday night, did not sound sleepy at all. She sounded, Naomi thought, like someone who had been waiting a very long time for a phone to ring and had almost stopped believing it would. Grant Holloway did not like waiting, and he especially did not like waiting in a hospital corridor. On the night he had finally gotten free of his marriage, He sat in a molded plastic chair with his overcoat folded across his knees and checked his phone every half minute. And beside him Sloane scrolled through something on her own screen and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say that would improve the situation. He had come because the hospital's automated line had left a message, and because some cautious lawyerly part of him understood that a man who ignored his collapsing wife on the night he divorced her might find that fact waved around later in ways that cost money. He had not come because he was worried. He wanted to be clear about that, even to himself. He was here to be seen to have come. That was all. How long does this take? Sloane murmured, not really asking. No idea. He stood, restless, and started toward the desk to demand something. He didn't reach it. At the far end of the corridor, the elevator opened and 3 people stepped out who did not belong to a hospital. 2 were men in dark, well-cut coats, the kind of dark that reads as formality rather than fashion. The third was an older man, perhaps 60, silver-haired, carrying a slim locked case and an air of enormous, unhurried patience. He was speaking quietly into a phone, and the language was French. Not the quick, loose French of a Montreal street, but something more careful, older, each syllable set down like a coin on a counter. Behind them walked a woman with a leather portfolio held against her chest like something precious. And behind her, 2 people in plain dark suits who were unmistakably there to watch the room. Grant stopped where he stood. He watched them move down the corridor, not fast, but with a purpose that made the nurses look up and a night administrator materialize out of a side hallway, straightening her lanyard to greet them in a voice pitched low and urgent. The silver-haired man ended his call. The whole group turned toward Bay 6. Grant sat back down slowly. "Who are they?" Sloane asked. He didn't answer because he didn't know, and because he had just felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific unease of a man who has walked into a room he did not book. The notary's name was Etienne Charbonneau, and he had been searching, on and off, for the child of the Beauval line, for the better part of 3 decades. He introduced himself to Elise from the foot of the bed, his English immaculate and lightly accented, his manner that of a man used to grave rooms and long silences. "Madame," he said, and then, catching himself with the smallest bow of his head, "Mademoiselle Tanner, forgive the hour and forgive thee." He gestured faintly at the men behind him, the case, the whole abrupt apparatus of it, the manner of our arrival. "There have been false matches over the years. People come forward. Documents are forged. I have learned to be cautious, and I have learned that caution is a kind of cruelty of its own, because it means that when the true one appears, we descend upon her with all of this." He almost smiled. "You are not a false match. I knew it the moment my associate described the pendant, and I have known it more surely with every record we've pulled tonight." He set the case on the tray table and opened it. Inside, beneath a modern laminate cover, lay a document dense with seals and signatures and a sheet of old rag paper whose watermark showed faintly through the newer page laid over it. "I will not overwhelm you with history you did not ask for," Charbonneau said. "But you should have the shape of it. There was a family in the eastern townships, the Cantons de l'Est, that held land and title going back to the French regime. A seigneurie in the old sense, and later a great many other things. Mills, then paper, then holdings scattered across 2 provinces, and finally a foundation. When the family had more money than it had heirs to spend it. The Beauval." He said the name gently as if it were a person in the room. "In the last generation there was one daughter. She left home young. She quarreled with her father, a hard man, by every account, and I say that as someone who administered his estate. She lived under other names. She had a child. And then she died very young in a hospital much like this one, without ever telling the child's caretakers who the child was." He turned the document so it faced her. "We have kept the search open all this time because the estate could not be settled until we knew. Because there was, somewhere, a person who did not know what she was." He touched the paper lightly. "I believe that person is you. And I believe that within a day, perhaps 2, we will be able to confirm it with the certainty the law requires, and restore to you a name that no one ever spoke over your cradle." Elise looked down. At the bottom of the page, below all the official density, was a line of careful script. A name, her name, a version of it she had never in her life heard aloud. Elise Marie Constance de Beauval. Her eyes moved across it slowly. The corridor beyond the curtain had grown loud, voices, footsteps, the small commotion of a place absorbing something it hadn't prepared for. Charbonneau glanced toward the sound. "When the registry office confirms a match of this kind," he said quietly, "it notifies others interested parties. That is unavoidable. There will be people who wish to be near you very quickly, for reasons both good and poor. My colleagues are here to see that the poor reasons do not reach you before you're ready." He looked at her with something that was almost tenderness. "You need decide nothing tonight, you need only rest." Naomi had stepped out to give them the room, and now she came back in, and she looked at Charbonneau, and then at Elise, and something in her face made Elise go very still. "There's one more thing," Naomi said. "It came up in your intake blood work, and it's not related to any of this. I'd have told you regardless of who walked through that curtain." She sat back down on the stool closer this time, and her voice softened into the register doctors keep for the sentences that change a life. You're pregnant, Elise. Early, about 7 weeks, you may not have known. She hadn't. The room held it. The monitor beeped its small steady syllable into the quiet. Elise put one hand flat against her own stomach, without deciding to, and looked at nothing at all, and felt the floor of her life tilt for the second time that night, though this time it did not frighten her. Across the tray table, Charbonneau went very still himself. He and Naomi exchanged a look, the look of two people who understand at once that the arithmetic of a situation has changed, that this is no longer a story about a single woman and a name. The old notary set down his pen. When he spoke, his voice had dropped almost to nothing. Then the line does not end, he said, mostly to himself, and Elise heard in it something she would only understand later, that for 30 years, this old man had been the keeper of a family that had, as far as the law was concerned, run out of future. And now, on a snowbound Tuesday in a hospital bay, it had one. The waiting area of Aiden's emergency department was the same as every hospital waiting area. Rows of bolted plastic chairs, a television bolted high on the wall running the weather, vending machines humming. But the air in it had changed. Charbonneau's 2 watchers stood near the mouth of the corridor. The night administrator hovered at the desk speaking to no one, and the handful of people who had been waiting there for ordinary, unglamorous reasons had all become quietly, electrically aware that something extraordinary was moving through the building nearby. Grant stood the moment he saw Naomi come out from behind the curtain. I want to see my wife, he said. Your former wife. Naomi said it evenly, without malice, exactly as she'd heard the patient's own tone earlier and matched it. She'll be out shortly if she wishes to be. I'd ask you to stay where you are. Grant's jaw worked. He was a man who had spent 20 years being the person other people waited for, and the reversal did not sit in him well. I have a right. You have a signed dissolution in your coat pocket, Naomi said, not unkindly. You gave up a number of rights this evening. That was your choice. Please sit down. He sat. Sloane's hand touched his sleeve and he shook it off without looking at her. 2 minutes passed. Then 5. Then the curtain drew back and Charbonneau came first and one of his colleagues, and the woman with the portfolio, and finally in the same dress she'd worn to the ballroom, her coat over one arm, Elise. She had fixed her hair with her fingers, she was pale still, but something in the way she held the air around her had shifted, and the whole room felt it before it could name it. She did not walk like a woman who had fainted on a sidewalk. She walked like a person who has finally been told the truth about herself and discovered it to be larger, not smaller, than anything she had feared. The television kept murmuring about the snow. The lights kept up their flat institutional glare, but the low conversations in the waiting room stopped, one after another, in the way sound stops when something enters a space that commands attention without asking for it. Grant got to his feet. Elise, she stopped. She looked at him, and it was the looking that undid him. Because there was no anger in it, and no triumph, and no grief, only a clear, unhurried attention, the attention of a person who has finished something inside herself and no longer needs anything at all from the man in front of her. I heard, he said. His voice had lost the boardroom flatness. What was underneath it was rawer, younger, the voice of a man who has just watched the floor go out from under a building he thought he owned. I heard what they were saying. Elise, I didn't know. You have to understand that. None of this. I didn't know. I know you didn't, she said. Then, he stepped closer and one of Charbonneau's colleagues shifted, not quite blocking him, and Grant stopped. Then listen, the papers aren't filed. It's not final until Kessler files, and he hasn't. Everything I said tonight, people say things when a marriage ends, you know that. We don't have to do this, we could? You handed me a pen, Elise said. Her voice was so level, so entirely without heat, that it was worse for him than shouting would have been. The room heard it and leaned into the quiet. In a room full of 200 people, she went on. You handed me a pen. You put her. She glanced once briefly at Sloane, who had drifted a step back from Grant's side and was no longer standing quite with him. You put her at the table beside you. You told me I didn't belong in your world. And you were right about the first part, Grant. I never did belong in it. He opened his mouth. But you were wrong about why, she said. You thought I didn't belong because I had nothing. You looked at me for 4 years and you never once saw anything worth keeping. That's not because there was nothing there. She held his eyes. It's because you were never able to see it. Some people can't. It isn't a flaw in the thing they're looking at. Sloane had gone entirely still. Elise, please, Grant said. And now, she said gently, almost kindly, which was the cruelest part of all, you never will. She turned. Charbonneau moved with her, and his people arranged themselves around her in a loose, unhurried perimeter, not blocking anyone, not threatening, simply present, the way a family stands around one of its own. The administrator hurried to hold the doors, and the people in the waiting room drew back on their own, without being asked, the instinctive way a crowd parts for something it understands, without being told, to be significant. Grant took 2 steps after her. One of the dark-suited men lifted a hand, not roughly, just firmly, palm out, and that was all it took. He stopped. He stood in the middle of the waiting room in his good overcoat, and he watched her go through the doors into the snow, and he did not have a single thing left to say that anyone in the building was obliged to hear. Beside him, quietly, Sloane said, "Grant." He didn't look at her. She said it again, differently, and he still didn't look, and she understood. Sloane was many things, but she was not slow. Exactly what that meant. She reached down and picked up her small green bag from the chair. She had come tonight attached to a man who was going somewhere, and she was leaving attached to a man who had just watched his somewhere walk out into the cold. She did not say goodbye. She left through the other set of doors, out toward the parking garage, alone, her heels quick on the tile, and she did not once glance back at the man she'd called a season's worth of things. Grant stood in the emptying waiting room for a long time. The weather scrolled on the television. Somewhere a monitor beeped. He realized, the only person in the room now who had somewhere he was supposed to be, and no one left who cared whether he got there. The unraveling was not loud. That was the thing about the way Grant Holloway's world came apart. It made almost no noise at all, which was the same quality he had so admired in himself. It began within the week, in the small language of unreturned calls. A financier he'd been courting for 2 years. A man whose capital anchored the whole Sherburne redevelopment. Sent his regrets through an assistant and did not reschedule. Grant told himself it was the season. Then a counselor who'd been friendly at 4 consecutive galas failed to recognize him at a 5th. Then the sales agent on the waterfront tower phoned to say that a silent partner had exercised a clause no one had thought about in years, and that the financing structure Grant had built the entire deal around had, quietly gone. He spent a long night with his lawyer, and a longer one with a bottle before he understood the shape of it. The Beauval Foundation was not a thing a person read about in the paper. It did not put its name on buildings, but it held positions. In banks, in funds, in the patient, invisible tissue of money that decides which developers get bridged through a rough quarter and which are quietly allowed to fall. For 20 years Grant had been borrowing in effect from the goodwill of a world he did not control. He had simply never had occasion to notice who ultimately sat at the top of it. Now the woman he had handed a pen to in a room full of people sat, or would soon, very near that top. And a great many careful men who had never met her had done the arithmetic he had failed to do, and had decided, without a single meeting, which side of the ledger Grant Holloway now belonged on. 3 weeks after the gala he went to a charity dinner he had attended for 6 years running. He put on the suit that fit and arrived with his name on a reservation, and he stood by the bar for 40 minutes, and watched the host glance at him and look away, and a board member he'd cultivated for 2 years fail to cross the room, and a man he'd golfed with a dozen times find a reason the conversation had to end. He understood slowly, with the particular horror of a person accustomed to being sought, that no one was coming toward him, and that no one was going to. The entire social architecture he had spent a life building had closed its doors without a sound, the way a house shuts up for the winter, and left him standing in the cold of a heated room. He left before the main course. It was still snowing. Elise did not watch any of it. She was told, later, in the mild way her new advisors told her things, that certain matters concerning her former husband's business had resolved themselves. And she asked no questions, because she found she did not want to build a new life on the pleasure of watching an old one collapse. That was a choice she made deliberately, in a quiet room, in the first week, that she would not become someone whose satisfaction depended on his ruin. She let it happen. She simply declined to enjoy it. There is a difference, and she meant to live inside it. She almost declined the estate itself. That surprised everyone, including her. In the second week Charbonneau laid out, with great gentleness, the full scope of what was hers. The domain in the townships, the foundation, the holdings, a fortune large enough that its numbers had stopped meaning anything to her by the 3rd page, and her first, strongest instinct had been to push it all away, to sign it into the foundation's charitable work, and keep the condo on Sherburne and go on being Elise Tanner, who knew who she was and owed no one anything. It was the child that changed her mind. She sat one long gray afternoon with her hand on her stomach and thought about the thing she had never had, which was the plain knowledge of where a person comes from. She had grown up as a file. She had grown up as a placement, a case number, a girl handed from house to house with a silver disc she didn't understand knocking against her collarbone. And she found she could not do to her own child the thing that had been done to her, could not, out of pride, throw away the one inheritance that mattered, which was not the money at all but the answer. Here is where you are from. Here are the people who were yours. Here is a name that was waiting for you before you were born. She would take it, she decided, so that she would have it to give away. The estate was 2 hours east of Montreal, past the last of the highway's long straight sweeps up into the low old mountains where the snow lay deep and clean between the sugar bushes. Elise sat in the back of the lead car with the heater ticking and watched the country change. The strip malls thinning, then the towns, then the covered bridges and the church spires and the endless white fields, with their fence lines drawn in charcoal against the snow. Charbonneau rode beside her and said very little, which she was grateful for. The gates were old iron, drifted at the base, and when the car passed through them, the noise of the outside world dropped away the way it does when you enter somewhere built to outlast the people who built it. The drive was long and lined with sugar maples, bare and enormous. At the end of it stood a stone house the color of the winter light, older than the country around it, and in front of the house in the cold, stood a small line of people who had spent their whole working lives keeping a place ready for someone who might never come. A steward, a cook, a groundskeeper and his son, an old woman who had been the last Beauval's own nurse, and who had, Elise would learn, refused for 30 years to believe the line was finished. They stood in the snow, waiting to receive her. Elise looked at the grass, still faintly green in the sheltered lee of the house where the drifts hadn't reached, and at the smoke going straight up from the chimneys into the still air, and at the faces turned toward the car. Hopeful, uncertain, some of them wet, and she pressed one hand lightly against her stomach, where the whole future of a family she had never met had quietly taken up residence. She did not look back down the drive, toward the gates, toward the city, toward the man who had told her in a room full of strangers that she did not belong. And so the man who had once held everything ended with nothing. No wife, no partner beside him, no room left that would rise when he entered it. The woman he'd chosen was gone the same night his power was. Because it had never been the man they'd valued, only the doors he could open, and the doors had closed. But Elise had never needed his world to be worth something. She had come from something older and quieter, and far more durable, and she had carried the proof of it against her collarbone, through every house that had ever handed her along, without once knowing what it was. He had not lost her because she changed. He lost her because in 4 years he never once bothered to see her, and by the time the whole world made him look, she was already home, warm and utterly beyond his reach. And if this reminds you that the truest worth is the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind people miss precisely because it never begged to be seen, then you already understand the only thing this story was ever trying to say.